Para hoy tenemos el Keynote del día y bueno, tenemos otra Wonder Woman, another Wonder Woman. El nombre de ella es Tiffany Farriss, trabaja como CEO en Palantir.net. Tiene más de 20 años de experiencia en desarrollos web y consultorías. Además es de los nuestros, ella es matemática, tiene una maestría en matemática de la Universidad de Northwestern University y bueno, ha hecho se ha enfocado en modelaje y interacción humano-computadora. Entonces, en estos momentos ella funge como tesorera de la asociación Drupal a nivel internacional y para nosotros es un orgullo tenerla hoy aquí presente en Costa Rica dándonos este keynote. Yo quisiera, antes de que ella empiece a dar el keynote, que le demos un buen aplauso de recibimiento.
Hola, buenos días y gracias por la invitación. Me llamo Tiffany, hablo muy poco español, so lo siento. Thank you so much to the organizers of Drupal Camp Costa Rica for inviting me here today. This is my first visit to Costa Rica and it is such a beautiful place. The organizing team has done an amazing job. I want to thank Elaine and Raul and Kenny and Enzo and just everybody. It's been everything that anyone ever told me it was, and more so. So it's been one of the best camps that I've ever been to. So thank you so much for having me. So there are two possible reasons that I was invited here today to speak with you. The first possibility is because I've had the privilege of serving as the Drupal Association treasurer for the last million years, since 2011. And if you've ever worked with me or just even listened to my introduction from Oscar, like, I am a numbers girl. I am in my happy place when I'm looking over balance sheets, combing through data, or planning out strategies to help Drupal run the best of the web. I am in the last few months of my term, and the Drupal community has grown and changed so much in that time. Suffice it to say, I have learned a lot, and I feel truly grateful for the experience of having served in the DA. After 2 years at Drupal VZW, and then the last 6 years with DCI, have I got stories to tell. But since you heard so many wonderful stories from Megan yesterday, I don't really think that's why I'm here. The second option, and my guess, is that I'm here because I'm the CEO of Palantir.net, along with George Demet, who's also here. Palantir is a web design and development firm based in Chicago, and together George and I have run the firm for the last 21 years. For most of that time, I served as the president of Palantir, and I was really involved in kind of day-to-day operations, but 4 years ago, I became the CEO as well. And that process was more than just a title change. I had worked for many years before that to transition kind of the operational side of Palantir, which I love still, so that I could really help George focus on our mission, our vision, and our values. So this change gave me both the time and the responsibility to look beyond those day-to-day operational tasks and think more deeply about the whys of Palantir and not so much the what and the how. What we've always understood is that Palantir is about people. It's about our colleagues, it's about our clients, it's about our community, and those who rely on the solutions that we build. But that's not unique to Palantir. The quality of any professional services firm distills down to the people who work there. What we also know is that the tenure of a person at any company is about 4 years. But in tech, that's even lower. It's about 3 years. And if you look at like the top US tech firms, Amazon, LinkedIn, Microsoft, SAP, Facebook, Google, PayPal, Oracle, their average tenure is less than 24 months. Professional services firms depend on people who will leave. And they're going to leave probably sooner than you think. That's the context of a modern professional services firm, and companies need to embrace that and adapt to it. Once you do, it frames the path to success in a new way. You start asking questions like, how do we create an environment that succeeds because of its team, but that success isn't dependent on any one person? How do we align the company and the individual interests so that everyone benefits from however much time they have to work together? So, what's a company to do? You might be thinking to yourself, all right, let's just hire rock stars. Like, hiring a steady stream of highly experienced Drupal people steeped in the community is definitely a strategy that many have tried. We did, right? That was absolutely how Palantir grew our original Drupal team. But I don't actually think that that's the answer. A senior-only hiring strategy is problematic for several reasons. First, it doesn't scale. There are not enough people working in Drupal, let alone enough rock stars to keep up with demand. Two, it's really expensive. The standard professional services model relies on a range of experience levels. You could decide to try and make a go of it as what's called a boutique professional services firm, but then go back and see number one, you still have a talent shortage that you have to deal with. And it would leave you very vulnerable to the downward price pressures driven by the commoditization we've been seeing in the Drupal development market. And three, there's little competitive advantage. In this scenario, what is a company offering that a team of freelancers who frequently work together doesn't already offer? And the last one is, I think that a rock star mentality perpetuates inequality. If you're only hiring from the available group of senior and experienced people, you're missing out on the opportunity to address the pipeline and the retention problems for underrepresented groups. We know that groups of diverse problem solvers consistently outperform groups of high ability problem solvers. So each of us needs to be working on making sure that our teams look like the users we're serving. Now, I love supergroups as much as anybody else. But let's be real, we know they don't last very long. Placing your bets on a short-term condition is not exactly a great strategic choice if you're trying to mitigate short tenures and build something sustainable. Besides, I've always aspired for Palantir to be an orchestra, right? I want us to be filled with expert musicians in an ever-changing composition based on whatever work we're performing. Companies do serve a purpose beyond just the purely logistical and annoying functions of having a bank account or paying taxes or doing payroll or offering benefits. And it might seem regressive of me to say in the gig economy, but I think that companies add value to the teams and the work that they do. That value is encapsulated in the organization's culture. So there's an MIT professor by the name of Edgar Schein, and he has spent his whole lifetime studying leadership and organizations. He defines an organizational culture as the pattern of basic assumptions that a given group has either invented or discovered or developed in learning to cope with its problems, whether those problems are external adaptations, read clients, or internal integration, read drama, and that have worked well enough in the past to be considered valid, right? And so therefore, those patterns are then taught to the newbies, right? Think about, in the Drupal world, we don't kill kittens, right? You don't hack core, and that's what you know. So even if you don't remember when that meme was started, or you weren't here when that started, you know that now because that's part of the organizational culture of Drupal. If we want to maximize the potential of individuals, we have to create a culture that essentially creates this scaffolding for learning and development and provides this lens through which the memories of the hard-earned past experiences are viewed and then understood. I'm really curious about how we do that both organizationally at Palantir and as a community within tech and more broadly within society. So whenever I start to think about change, my mind conjures up images of water, right? It both drives change and represents this kind of odd consistency throughout change. I appreciate it, I admire it, sometimes fear it. Water covers 71% of our planet, and yet wars are still fought over it. Water is essential for life as we know it. It can be destructive or creative, sometimes both. It can be violent or calm. But the one thing I know about water is that it is patient and persistent and always finds a way. The power of water is evidenced in some really, truly spectacular ways. And one of my favorite ones is actually the Grand Canyon. I think of the Grand Canyon as kind of the longest and most amazing collaboration in the history of the planet, right? So it took the Colorado River millions of years to carve out the Grand Canyon as we see it today. But what's really interesting is the water alone didn't shape it. Even as the river was carving out the canyon and eroding the canyon floor, the canyon itself continued to grow and to change as the Colorado Plateau pushed up its walls. So I think of water as a great metaphor for experience. Our life experiences shape us, but our final shape depends on how we choose to grow during that process. Now, water isn't always destructive, and it can actually be kind of necessary and helpful. And as I did today, I've already mentioned in this talk how much I love numbers and how I'm a numbers girl. But one of the other things that you might not know is that in addition to math and astrophysics, I was a classicist. I love, ancient cultures, and I think it's really interesting to think about what we can learn from the ancient past, especially those achievements that have been really hard to replicate in the modern era, even with all the technological advances that have happened over the last 2 millennia. One such technology is concrete. So many Roman aqueducts and sewers and piers still survive to this day. They are as strong or sometimes even stronger than when they were originally created, despite the fact that they've had this continuous exposure to water by their design. What's really interesting is that a study done a few years ago looked at this block of concrete that had been submerged off the coast of a little bay by Naples, and they actually found that it had little to no wear and tear after 2,000 years of being submerged in seawater. We have modern bridges that degrade over a period of decades, right? How is it that Roman concrete is so special? Now, human beings have been building things with concrete for the last 8,000 years. And over that time, the basic components really have remained unchanged. Concrete is fundamentally a cement binder, an aggregate, right? Some sand and some gravel, water to activate a chemical reaction. The concrete itself, the cement itself, makes up such a small portion, right? Most of it, 90% of what goes into any concrete mixture is just whatever was nearby, right? It changes all the time. So again, what gives Roman concrete that's 90% different every time you make it? What gives it that strength? We know that Roman concrete has higher durability and higher performance than anything we've created since then, right? We even try, with modern concrete buildings, we try and prop it up, right? You've got rebar that sits through it, we've got steel reinforcements, we add chemicals to it, we add minerals to it. We're still trying to make it super strong and durable. And after, thwarting the concrete industry for the last 100 years, they think that they have finally figured out the key. So the kind of cement that was used in Roman structures literally got stronger over time, not in spite of its exposure to the harsh elements and water, but precisely because of it. It turns out that water, when mixed with the Roman cement, the kind of volcanic ash that they used, caused a continuous chemical reaction. So that even after the concrete set, that reaction was creating these minerals, and those minerals would fill in the air pockets that either were created when they made the cement or got eroded over time. So literally, experience makes all of these structures so much stronger. I've come to understand Palantir as serving the same purpose as cement in this concrete mixture. We're a small proportion, right, of what goes into the projects we build. But it's our role to bind and to give strength from project to project, even as the aggregate team components change. We bring people together to build something wonderful, to build something that we hope lasts and something that is stronger the more experience and exposure we get. As CEO, I've really focused my curiosity on researching exactly how to build a company culture where both the organization and those within it continue to learn, to grow, to adapt over time like that Roman concrete. I really want Palantir to be cement that, regardless of the changes to the team, produces projects that are consistently known for their durability and their strength. Right now, learning cultures seem to be the exception, not the rule. The status quo works for some people, but not for everybody. And this is a problem because, again, we know that high-performing teams are outperformed by diverse teams. Beyond the structural and institutional issues, there will always be those who've had fewer opportunities or resources than others. Success in the workplace shouldn't be predetermined by the opportunities, advantages, and experience you have before you get there. I think this question is particularly relevant right now, right? Globally, we are transitioning from an industrial society to an information society. There's the rapid changes we've seen over the last 50 years, driven by information technology, has impacted everything. It's impacted our work, our education, our health, the economy, politics, in such a fundamental way. The fact that I walk around with a computer in my pocket that is more powerful than the ones that they use to send people to the moon is incredible. So thanks to the internet, we regularly communicate as easily and as instantaneously with those around the world as we do with those around the corner. Our colleagues and our clients might be next to us, but increasingly they're spread over multiple locations and multiple time zones. The impact of all of this change, of all of this technology, of this proliferation of information, is ultimately up to us. We get to decide how this shapes our future. Now, when anybody's confronted with something new, you have three choices, right? You can allow that information, that new experience, to affirm what you already believe. In essence, take it as confirmation that you should just keep on keeping on with whatever you were doing, right? And this is the concern about social media, right? Social media creates these cul-de-sacs where we're only shown information that conforms to our existing beliefs, right? It wasn't intended that way, but that's what it does. New information can inform you about a topic, right? We can take these advancements and we can make incremental improvements to how we go about doing things, right? Before fake news cast doubt about the reliability of the media or the bottom fell out of its revenue model, this is what good journalism regularly did. It exposed previously unknown information that helped us see what we as a society could do better. The third option is to allow it to transform how you understand everything in the world around you. And I'm here today to advocate for transformation. We have the opportunity to shift the nature of work, to increase access to participation in tech, to incorporate the skills and talents of more people than we ever have before. It's also a unique moment in human history because the barriers to access, while still present, are dramatically lower than they have ever been, giving each of us much more control and agency over our own success than ever before. Where we find ourselves now shares a lot in common with when society shifted from an agrarian culture to an industrialized one, starting in the late 18th, 19th century in Europe. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, the economy had been heavily concentrated in food production, leaving very limited non-agricultural labor. And then in turn, if you didn't have people to do it, there really wasn't much non-agricultural production. Basically, everybody pretty much worked at farming. And as a result, there were only two classes: the people who owned the land and the people who worked the land. Then, to horribly simplify things and speed up time, the steam engine came along. So one of the things that I've always wondered is, why didn't we end up with a steampunk future, right? So if the steam engine is credited with sparking the Industrial Revolution, why doesn't it really have much of a place in our world today? Well, it turns out that steam technology itself had a catalytic effect on other technologies. So the same scientific process that had been used to discover steam power was then really rapidly used to improve the efficiency of existing hydraulic and wind power. It was used to invent the mechanical generation of electric power, development of the light bulb, and then the internal combustion engine. That was truly this kind of transformational moment in history when those new fuel sources enabled accelerating technological advances. Those technologies meant, for the first time in human history, less than half the population had to be involved in feeding everyone. This newly available workforce then combined with large-scale mass production technology, which it also made possible, and as a result, it changed socioeconomic life globally, reinventing the established hierarchy, improving the standard of living, and creating a middle class. Yay! So in addition to technology itself, it takes visionary leadership to push beyond incremental improvements to make things easier. Transformational leaders see how these new advancements open up opportunities to change how we do things. This is what pushes society or a community past what had previously seemed possible. Take, for example, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is considered one of the greatest military minds of all time for his revolutionary command of the French army. 18th century European warfare before Napoleon had been largely unchanged since the invention of gunpowder. Warfare was this really... So it was like super waterfall, right? So you'd have all your generals get together and they would like figure out where they were gonna move everybody on the board, and then they would do it, right? And it was just this very separated process where the planning and the execution were distinct in separate stages. It was also generally conducted as attrition warfare. Anybody familiar with attrition warfare? Yeah, it's super painful. So basically, you line up all your people and you have the opposing sides fight each other until one side takes so many losses of personnel and material that it can't fight anymore, right? So in that kind of a strategy, whoever has the most resources at the beginning of the battle is gonna win, right? Bringing in my classics history, attrition literally means to grind down. It is, the losses of attrition warfare are just mind-bogglingly staggering. But what is also really interesting to note about attrition warfare, like literally where you line people up and they start going at it, is that the casualties on each side are roughly equal until one side breaks rank. So when one side breaks rank, then everybody rushes in, and then the losses really pile up, and you know, it's got to play out because the planning and the execution are separate, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, that's just going to happen. But once the tide turns in the battle, you know that it's going to be completed. And that's not to say that there weren't some really brilliant tacticians of this era. King Frederick the Great, actually, of Prussia was a brilliant tactician, and Napoleon himself was actually a really amazing student of the lessons of the battles of the 7 Years' War. Now, since I'm curious about how leaders use technology to bring out transformational change, I'd really like to dig into what innovations Napoleon implemented and why they worked. Napoleon's goal, right, was to get a decisive victory using the fewest resources. He adapted a strategy of maneuver warfare, right, which basically uses shock and awe to incapacitate the opposing forces' decision-making. His objective there, within that strategy, was to prioritize speed and mobility. One of the things the Industrial Revolution made possible was the standardization of, well, anything. In Napoleon's case, he used the standardization of cannons to allow the French army's artillery to be significantly lighter and significantly smaller than those of opposing forces, while just as effective. So that gave Napoleon a speed advantage that allowed much more tactical use of a larger brigade of artillery. Napoleon used his cannons as basically a spear, right, to punch a hole in his opponent's line to allow his cavalry and his infantry to advance in a column and turn the tide of the battle. Napoleon realized that if the French army was organized around legions, right, which are about 10,000, 12,000 people, with brigades of specialists, 2,000, 3,000, brigades like a few thousand, he would have these brigades of these specialists, whether it was artillery or cavalry or infantry. The commanders could create much more sophisticated maneuvers that better responded to the conditions on the field. Technology had previously been used at kind of a much smaller scale, at the scale of maybe hundreds, right? That you might think about using 500 people here to help 500 people there, and you thought about it in these much more discrete, much smaller terms. But the sustained scale of how Napoleon thought about his army and implemented was at such a level of complexity that no one had ever tried to implement it and could not use it effectively. Think about it. It's hard to get 10,000 people to do the same thing at the right time, even with all of our modern communication aids, right? The French army was able to do this while fighting a battle. Napoleon used rapid experimentation to try new things. He was constantly learning what would work. And then he also learned what didn't work. So he wanted to understand when and why. He used that knowledge to develop a playbook based on the lessons that he was learning from these defeats, and then trained his commanders on how to adapt to this new level of warfare complexity. The Napoleonic Wars lasted decades. No one had the luxury of learning at leisure. Everyone learned while they were doing. Even though the French forces were outnumbered, initially because they didn't have another choice, and later on intentionally so, Napoleon's army would go on the offensive in the battlefield and win. Napoleon had this really highly trained and knowledgeable military, superior collaboration and communication via his playbook. He had a commitment to learning and a legion-level system thinking approach, all of which added up to allowing him to actively manage a battle and then opportunistically adjust his strategy in the meantime. He basically invented Agile. So there's that. Because Napoleon had this kind of first mover advantage and the agility to respond whenever he saw an opportunity, Napoleon could deploy his strengths against his opponent's weaknesses. He used this, what's called maneuver warfare, to leverage his enterprise-level combined arms approach and his mobile artillery to disrupt the established power dynamics of Europe for decades. Napoleon didn't invent any of this. What he did is he transformed his mental representation to be able to handle the larger complexity of larger groups of soldiers executing increasingly sophisticated maneuvers. So, because it's been a while since I said Drupal, I'm just going to say Drupal, and I will give you a Drupal analogy. So, Drupal, 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 right? Okay, so the Napoleonic forces adopted a new paradigm that was different from the dominant conventions of warfare, and that paradigm was as different from what the other generals were thinking about as the difference between the mental paradigm necessary to run 2,000 bespoke Drupal sites and architecting and building a single Drupal platform for continuous deployment, right, that runs several thousand sites. As any of you know who've done this kind of major platform work, the architecture required to build a single standalone site is simpler, right? It's easier to conceptualize, it's easier to understand. You're probably going to set it up faster, it's easier to clone, but it takes a lot more complex modeling, not to mention a lot more communication and a lot more collaboration to plan and execute a well-constructed Drupal platform. But that said, in cases of great scale, the platform has advantages that are just unparalleled. You can't do it by building single sites. It generates efficiencies of scale that come with the standardization of the platform, resulting in fewer resources, greater speed of deployment, and lower cost. So think about Napoleon as having built a platform of an army, and that should help bring it back. So Napoleon's forces weren't the only ones who learned and adapted on the job. Eventually, other commanders adapted their mental representations to a more complex and sophisticated maneuver-based combined arms approach as well. These commanders used Napoleon's own strategies to defeat him, most notably Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. However, not all of Napoleon's opponents developed that more sophisticated mental model. Like, a lot of people just didn't get his strategy. But instead, they focused on some of his tactics. They focused on that tactical implementation to very different ends. For Napoleon, standardization and training were tactics which he used to meet his speed and mobility objectives so that he could have a decisive, quick victory, right? He wanted to lose as few resources as possible, and that was his path. As we all probably know, it's not really easy or fast to reverse engineer someone's strategy from the results. Consequently, it's really easy to mislearn the lessons of history without such a context. You kind of go through checking these tactical tick boxes, but if you don't have the same objectives and you don't have the same strategy, your results are going to vary widely. This is, alas, how we ended up with the US educational system. So, reeling from his defeat in the Napoleonic Wars, Frederick William III enhanced the formal education system that his grandfather, Frederick the Great, had put into place. He envied the effectiveness of a well-trained French army, and so the reforms he created emphasized the skills to be a good soldier, right? Technical skills like reading and writing, as well as these social skills like obedience, loyalty, duty, diligence. So this is called the Prussian educational system, and it later became adopted as the American educational system. So in the US, standardization became the strategy, and it was used to produce obedient citizens who could work in the factories created by the Industrial Revolution. So much so that you'll often hear it called the factory model of education. This type of school emphasizes top-down management, separation from the community, an emphasis on centralized planning, standardization, and efficiency in producing results. And although the manufacturing jobs have been on the decline for decades, and there is increased demand for knowledge workers, the educational system in the US to this day is still disproportionately focused around basic skills and encyclopedic knowledge, which is delivered through this kind of direct instruction and rigid classroom structures. You can still see the impact of these decisions in education flowing through into the workplace as assumptions. In the 1960s, there was this MIT professor called Douglas McGregor, and he asked a really simple question. He said, all right, what are your assumptions, implicit as well as explicit, about the most effective way to manage people? So he identified two opposing viewpoints. One of them he called Theory X, and the other he called Theory Y. So Theory X is super authoritarian, right? It assumes that if people weren't made to work, they wouldn't work. Or that you only ever work reluctantly, right? On the other side, you've got Theory Y, which is like, hey, work is natural, and if people are committed to the goals of the organization, they can do anything, right? Theory X, on the one hand, stresses the importance of rigid, strict supervision and external rewards and penalties. On the other hand, Theory Y is all about motivating, and you focus on the role that motivation, the job satisfaction has in motivating and encouraging people to approach tasks with limited supervision. So there are many Theory X work environments that are high performing, right? They're generally formalized organizations with tasks that are highly structured and precisely defined, right? Think manufacturing, right? You don't really want a lot of creative, assembly line workers. That's not going to do very well for you. So this kind of classical approach doesn't require maximizing the potential of any given team. In such an environment, the goal is just to standardize the work and standardize the workforce. But we're shifting to an information society, and automation is replacing those jobs. If you can standardize something so that anyone can do it, it's only a matter of time before that gets turned over to a machine or a computer. The jobs that remain are those that involve a higher degree of uncertainty, and high performance in such situations requires more than just basic skills and more than just basic problem solving. To adapt to the opportunities in the information society, we all have to focus on solving problems in a way that can't be replaced by a computer. This is why the biggest areas of opportunity for individuals are in knowledge organizations like the ones we all probably work in, where the tasks are especially well suited to Theory Y style of management. Theory Y managers believe the best in others. We believe in creating a supporting culture of growth and development, and that is necessary to achieve high performance. The level of autonomy and self-direction seems to facilitate this kind of creative problem solving that is required by the work that we all do. Even though McGregor, and I'm assuming most of us in this room here today, think that the Theory Y style of management is preferable, research shows that Theory Y workplaces don't always succeed. The primary criticism of it is that there only seem to be a certain group of people who naturally excel in that type of environment. The opportunity I see in an information society is to adapt our workplace cultures so that as many people as possible can succeed. Just as with Napoleon, I think learning is the key. So the shift from an industrial society to an information society began in the early 80s. It had become clear that the nature of much of the work required different skills to those that were needed by an industrialized workforce, and that the factory system of education needed reform. So basic skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic are no longer sufficient, and companies need people who are much stronger in interpersonal skills. The focus then became on identifying the components of what's called deeper learning, and so that we could all compete with a faster and more interconnected information society. So they call these the 21st century skills. This is a chart that was created by the National Research Council, which divides them into 3 areas, right? You've got your cognitive skills, your interpersonal skills, and your intrapersonal skills. Cognitive skills are the ones that emphasize non-routine problem solving, critical thinking, systems thinking. The interpersonal skills center around communication, soft skills, teamwork, cultural sensitivity, and dealing with diversity. And the intrapersonal skills deal with self-management, time management, self-development, self-regulation, adaptability, and executive function. Professional success is dependent on skills that we probably don't start off with when we begin our careers. So it becomes really clear that there's a personal incentive for learning, growing, and changing if you want to have a successful career. This creates that kind of alignment between the organizational learning goals I talked about earlier and individual career development goals. And I think that alignment creates the motivation for transforming our work cultures. There are a lot of skills up here, right? And I think that 6 of them are considered essential for deep learning, right? It's content knowledge, critical thinking and problem solving, communication, collaboration, learning how to learn, and a growth mindset. So when you think about those as a set, it kind of starts to make sense, right? In order to be professionally successful in an information society, you need to know how to learn to an expert degree and believe that you can. You need to be interested in learning new skills and information in such a way as to build expertise and then to be able to apply them at a systemic level. You need to be able to work with others, which requires a high degree of collaboration and communication. So what jumps out at me is just how much open source and Drupal pushes us toward these deeper learning objectives. We already know that participation in open source has a very similar incentive profile to the employee's motivation for engaging in a workplace. There's a professor out of Babson called Jonathan Sims, who has, there it is, who's been studying the Drupal community for quite a while, as well as other open source communities. And he's noted that the greatest benefit to organizations, meaning the companies that participate in open source and who are building Drupal, they receive the biggest benefit when their teams both give and receive help. That has a much stronger advantage than just giving and receiving code. It's all about the help. That level of engagement with open source is what actually leads to radical innovations within those firms. So by its very nature, contribution and participation in open source involves content knowledge, it involves critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration and communication. Now, I just want to note for a minute that there are so many ways to improve and support how open source does those things and provides practice and feedback in them, but this isn't that talk, right? What I'm interested in is that given that you already have the opportunity to practice and develop those skills, the focus of any efforts within Palantir or other organizations needs to be around creating a learning environment that will support the intra-skill development. So there's a Stanford professor by the name of Carol Dweck, and she has spent her whole career studying why people succeed and how to foster success. She has found that the key difference for success relates to a person's underlying beliefs about whether or not abilities change, right? This is called the implicit theories of intelligence. And so she's identified two areas. One is a fixed mindset. So in a fixed mindset, people believe that their basic qualities, whether it's intelligence or talent, are fixed traits. You got what you got. And folks with this mindset spend their time documenting their intelligence or their talent instead of developing them. They also believe that talent alone creates success without effort. In contrast, those with a growth mindset believe that their most basic abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. That brains and talent, it's just where you start. This view creates a love of learning and a resilience that's essential for great accomplishment. Hard work is not something that makes you vulnerable, but something that makes you smarter. Success or failure is about what you do, not who you are. As I mentioned, I live in Chicago. Any basketball fans? Anybody know who this is? Right. So whether you're a basketball fan or not, you probably have heard of Michael Jordan. So he's known for his career with the Chicago Bulls. He is widely considered the best basketball player of all time. You can look him up on Wikipedia, but he has this serious resume, right? He has 6 NBA championships. He was NBA Finals MVP 6 times. He was 5-time league MVP and a 14-time NBA All-Star. Amazing, right? So given that impressive resume, you might suspect that he was a natural talent. The reality is that Jordan was cut from his varsity basketball team his sophomore year because he had a lack of promise. Would you like to be that coach? So he didn't let that failure become his identity. He wasn't bad at basketball because this one coach said he was bad at basketball. What he did was he understood that failure was just an action. He wasn't there yet. And that motivated him to practice harder. And I think the thing that Jordan became the best at wasn't necessarily basketball, but he was the best at practicing basketball. He practiced harder than anyone else, right? He was the first in and the last out, and while he was practicing, he was always focusing on his fundamentals throughout his career. So there's this really famous Nike ad, maybe you've seen it, and it's Jordan, and he's narrating, and he says, I've missed more than 9,000 shots. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times, I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. And I have failed over and over and over again in my life. And this is why I succeed. So even when Jordan was at the top of his game, he continued to evolve that gameplay, making incremental improvements with his dedicated practice. He understood that there's always something to learn and always something to improve. Mindset is important to be aware of because it impacts a person's motivation toward achievement. It impacts what type of goals a person's likely to set, whether it's a performance goal or a mastery goal, how they respond to challenges, whether failure is an action due to a non-mastered skill or an identity, as in something the person will never excel at. To create an environment that fosters the potential of all individuals, a company needs to demonstrate its genuine belief in human development. A growth mindset culture has a few characteristics, right? It promotes managers who are passionate about teaching and learning, that have an openness to giving and receiving feedback, and a resilience in the face of challenges. It supports those managers with training in the specifics of effective communication and mentoring. It presents all skills as learnable. It conveys an organizational commitment to learning and perseverance, not just innate genius or talent. It gives feedback in a way that promotes learning and future success. And it presents managers as a resource for learning. Okay, so if I've convinced you now that you literally can learn anything, the question you should be asking is, okay, well, yeah, how? How do I do that? How do I learn? So it should come as no surprise that the answer is practice, but not just any kind of practice. Malcolm Gladwell has this book called Outliers, and he coined what is called the 10,000 hour rule, right? At its core, 10,000 hours. At its core, it says that regardless of the type of pursuit, whether you're interested in becoming an expert in music or an athletic, expert, or just being expert in your profession, that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert at something. He based this claim on this Swedish psychologist and Florida State University professor, K. Anders Ericsson, who spent his career studying expertise and performance. The only problem is, it's not true. I want to tell you a story. So, one day after school, right, a girl gets home and her mom is making a pot roast. And before the mom makes the pot roast, she cuts off both ends of the pot roast before putting it in to cook. She had seen her mom do this hundreds of times before, right? But for whatever reason that day, she's like, why do we cut the ends off the pot roast? And the mom said, I don't know, that's how my mom did it, right? So go ask your grandma. So the girl goes and she asks her grandma, she says, Grandma, why do you cut the ends off the pot roast? And grandma says, I never thought about it. I've just always done it that way. It's the way my mom did it. Go ask great grandma. So then the girl goes and she goes to ask her great grandma. She says, Great grandma, why do we cut the ends off the pot roast? And the great grandmother didn't say, well, that's because the way my mom did it. And she didn't say, because it makes it better. She said, well, when I was first married, we had a really small oven, and the pot roast didn't fit unless I cut the ends off, right? How many of us do a thing over and over and over again without trying, right? Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. Think about something that you know how to do without even thinking about it, whether it's like cooking or driving, riding a bike, or even like hobbies, right? If you played football your whole life, or tennis or swimming. Have you gotten any better at them lately, right? So Ericsson identified that the most common pattern of practice is what he calls naive practice. It's this kind of approach where you're like, okay, I want to get good enough that I can do this thing. So we kind of know what we want to do, like I want to be able to play tennis with my friends, and you get some instruction so that you reach an acceptable level. And then you let it become automatic, right? Once this happens, you could practice every day for the next 20 years, but you're not going to see any improvement. The fact is that any practice you allow to become automatic, you're going to get worse at over time. So your skills will gradually deteriorate in the absence of efforts to improve. The one thing that the 10,000 hour rule gets right is that it does take a tremendous amount of effort over many, many years to become accomplished in any field. But you have to keep in mind, not all practice leads to learning and improved performance. The good news is that there is literally no point at which performance maxes out or where additional practice doesn't lead to further improvement. The most effective forms of practice are doing more than helping your performance. They're increasing your ability to improve and to perform. Just think of Michael Jordan, right? That guy could have kept going forever, and he went until his body quit on him. Like, he could have been the greatest forever. What distinguishes those who become expert from everyone else is the quality and the quantity of their mental representations. Through years of practice, experts have developed these really complicated and sophisticated representations of the various situations that they're likely to encounter in their field. Experts see patterns in collections of things that seem random or chaotic to others. The benefit of these models is it helps the expert understand and interpret information, to keep it in their memory, to organize it, to analyze it, to figure out what to do because I know this thing. That's what was so innovative about Napoleon. He could see these patterns on the battlefield at a macro scale in a way no one else could. He could identify opportunities in the unfolding chaos of battle and use that insight to devise really sophisticated strategies that no one had ever done before or thought of before at the time when his troops were outnumbered, and still drive to this really swift and overwhelming victory. Once he had this transformative breakthrough in how he understood the potential of the French army, Napoleon continued to refine his approach, iterating, getting better from battle to battle. He further developed his mental representation through this kind of quick experimentation, using feedback from what he saw and from what he heard from his commanders, learning quickly what worked and what didn't work. Erickson would call what Napoleon did purposeful practice. So purposeful practice is this really well-defined, specific goals, and you put into place a realistic plan for incremental improvement. It's focused and it depends on feedback and requires challenge. You have to get out of your comfort zone. If you never get out of the comfort zone, you're never going to improve. The solution is not to try harder, it's to try smarter. But ultimately, even Napoleon was defeated. He didn't keep his edge forever. Turns out that the most effective way to become an expert is what Erickson calls deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is like purposeful practice, but instead of being self-driven, it requires a teacher who can practice activities and help you improve. It must occur in a well-developed field where the practice is informed by an expert performance and techniques of those who have come before. So deliberate practice develops skills in other people, develops skills that other people have already figured out, right? You're not going to be able to engage in deliberate practice if you're innovating and creating a new field. It involves constantly setting the bar just beyond what you can do. You never let up. You're just always, I'm going to push it way out there. Again, and like with purposeful practice, it demands your whole attention. You need to stay focused on it. You need to get feedback from others. You need to create and evolve your mental representation, your mental model for how you understand it always, consistently, if you're going to keep improving. So Napoleon's success was that what he did is he provided deliberate practice and training for his commanders. This was what Napoleon's playbook did. It captured his techniques and his mental representations that he had discovered so that it could be learned by the other French officers. Now, sorry for Napoleon, but he was also training his opponents who learned and got better over time. So they eventually mastered his own techniques, improved on them, and he was outmaneuvered and defeated by those very same techniques he had pioneered. The students surpassed the master. Anyone can improve, but it requires the right approach. It takes learning while real work gets done so that you and those around you can get into the habit of practicing and thinking about practicing. Ultimately, what is most important to learning is the doing. It's the practice. It's sort of ironic, right? Because for all of my words here this morning, I know I haven't helped any of you learn anything, right? But I do have a hope, right? My hope is that I piqued your curiosity. I hope that you're curious about learning where learning fits in your own career development. I hope that you're curious about how you and your work and your company and in your communities can change your habits and assumptions so that you drive and improve not just your own success, but the success of those around you. And with that, I want to leave you with a few words from the former U.S. Secretary of Education, John Gardner. There is something that I know about you that you may or may not know about yourself. You have within you more resources of energy than have ever been tapped. You have more talent than has ever been exploited, more strength than has ever been tested, and more to give than you have ever given. What are you going to learn next, and how are you going to help others? With that, I wish you the best of success.